So what do we like? Is addiction a disease, and or what is disease? What are we talking about? What do you think?
Yeah, and it's such a fascinating one because I think that's part of the struggle and why this gets to be so complicated, right?
Mm,
Everybody has kind of a different interpretation, I think, of disease, and
hmm
we internalize it, we visualize it, we see it as different things. And
hmm
that's, I mean, I did what I always do, which is I Googled it and
Yeah.
I mean,
What did
when you look
Google
at,
say a disease was?
I have to pull it up, but essentially it's
Yeah.
just kind of, I mean, any human or animal that it has some kind of malfunction or some kind of issue going
Malfunction.
on, right?
Yeah,
And I
that's an
don't think they
interesting
use
way to say it.
malfunction, but let me pull it up here. Disease.
Definition.
All right, so here we go. A disorder of structure or function in a human, animal, or plant, especially one that produces specific signs or symptoms, or
Hmm.
that affects a single location, is not simply a direct result of physical injury.
Hmm.
So I mean that's pretty wide, right? I mean that's going to cast an extremely wide net of
hmm
disease, and I think
I
that's
particularly like the word disorder.
yeah,
So I've got like a bit of spiritual reading in the background as well. I've got a master's in Buddhist studies, but don't tell anybody. Um, so in Buddhism, they have this metaphor for when someone's, well, I guess diseased, or the metaphor they use is a cart because they're before cars, but it's the cart where the axle between the two wheels has gone out of alignment. So on a cart like that, if the axle's even a little bit out of alignment, you can see the whole cart bounces from side to side because it all goes out of sync.
yeah,
So they call that like a that's what they were calling a disease when things are out of their proper order.
sure. And that's so anything that's out of that kind of optimal day to day, right? Like the state
Yeah,
of flow. Like
yeah,
we've all experienced those days where it just seems like everything's just in flow.
yeah,
And so I mean that's I think disease. That's where I think it's up to the interpretation of what you want to call it. But anything, I mean, that's where, especially when you get into mental health, right? I
mm,
mean, anything that impacts your day, the way that you see your day, or envision what your day is, that's going
hmm
to impact, and that's a disease. That's I mean, that's some kind of disorder, or malfunction. It's not running perfectly, right? So that's
exactly. But the only thing that I'm aware of as well, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what we think other people mean when they say addiction is a disease. But for me, I think there's a difference between disease and unease. So I think disease is when things are uh, out of their proper order, but unease is the natural sense of distress we get from doing things we ought to do. So it's not, I guess I'd like to be careful, like being a mental health kind of practitioner, to stay away from encouraging people to seek ease.
yeah,
So the opposite to disease is not easy.
correct.
So that's the danger, I think, sometimes when we talk about getting rid of disease. We're not talking about trying to find a moment where we're permanently at ease.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of my favorite authors, Mark Manson. I mean, I don't know if you've gotten into any of his books, but he always talks about, I mean, we seek out a life with no problems, right? And that's not a
Yeah,
reality. I mean, it's not,
that's
you're
a
not looking for a
massive
life with no
creation of a huge
problems.
problem to seek out lack of
Right.
problems. Yeah.
Right. And that's his whole point is you just want to get better problems. I mean,
hmm
we want to replace certain problems with better problems, and a lot. And I absolutely agree. I mean, I've personally found that, I mean, going through the things that you don't want to do, those things that aren't easy, those are always
Mm,
the things that are worth it, right? Like that's usually the where you have to go.
exactly.
It's avoiding that is not um, really the answer, right? That's
Yeah, and I mean there might be a terrible paradox or irony that we might get to later, where the addiction is seeking ease,
yeah,
and through that creates dis-ease and
yes.
more distress. So, but yeah, that's we're right. I'm running ahead of myself. But what do you think other people mean? Because I've heard that phrase, addiction is a disease, thousands of times. But
Yeah.
what do people really mean when they're saying that?
And I think just what I've seen people, and I know I was one of those, so I mean that's my interpretation at one point was that it was more that thing that was kind of genetic, that it was something that was a disease like other types of disease which we get.
Mm,
Sometimes it's behavioral, sometimes it's environmental, but I think we tend to focus on those genetic things, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's something that is just within us. And so it's
Mm.
something that I know, especially when you look in like 12-step programs or recovery programs, it's something that's always with you, right? And it's just, oh, well, this is just the way you were made. And
Mhm.
I think there's that view of disease or addiction as a disease. Does that kind of line up with what you think? Sometimes people,
I think that's what a lot of people mean when they say it. Yeah, that it's something ingrained
yeah,
into the body or the DNA of who they are. And yeah, I think it does come up quite a lot within the addiction recovery AA framework or recovery program. So I guess what I think of there is like having a functional analysis of it. It's like, okay, so that idea does in some way seem to be useful. So what are the pros of saying that it's inbuilt into your DNA?
yeah. And I know I'll speak personally. I know there was a time where that definitely made sense and lined up. And it was, okay, yeah, I have a disease, and going to meetings, doing these different things where that was kind of the treatment. And I
Mm,
still think that there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, maybe that's not the best way to describe it, but I
mm,
think we want to continue to improve in anything. It's exercise. I mean, if you stop working out, I mean, you're going to start to gain a few extra pounds, and you're going to get
mm.
those things, those kind of results that you don't want back. I
Can you
just, yeah,
can you
no.
tell me a little bit more about how it was useful for you at that stage to kind of take in that sense of, okay, I have a disease and this is the treatment. In what way was that useful for you?
Well, I think to the point of things being uneasy, and the
Mm,
things that you have to go into are going to be very difficult. And I think it is,
mm,
if you don't pace those things out, or I mean, obviously working with a professional like yourself, uh, it can be very overwhelming. And I
mm,
think you can get in one of those positions where everything just feels like, man, you're especially with addiction, you're already blaming yourself for getting yourself into the problem. And now if you're trying to get yourself out, and
mm,
it's solely on you, that, okay, this is all, uh, it's just me and the things I have to do. I think that thought that, hey, maybe some of this is genetic, and we don't know.
mm,
Obviously a lot of the research says a lot of it is genetic.
mhm,
um, I'd push back on that, but
mm,
I think it's helpful. I think there was a time where it was like, okay, hey, this makes sense. This helps me. It helped me get through those things. Hey, this is just the way it is. This is the way I'm wired. And you can start to see it, and you see that pattern develop in other areas of life. And it's like, okay, yeah. I mean, I tend to go into things deep. I tend to focus heavily on one thing, and get
mm,
kind of addicted to other things in life. I mean, I was a golfer, and I got really good at golf because I practiced a lot. I mean,
mm.
I was addicted to golf. So
Well,
you see these
you're
patterns,
getting
right?
into the another thing I'm interested in. We might cover it, which is getting addicted to things that are good for us, and what is that an addiction or not? But
Right.
the two things that you seem to be identifying there that were making that way of thinking useful for you at the time, the addiction is a disease. The two things you seem to be saying that were useful was it was helping you face the fact that this treatment recovery was going to be difficult, and then the other one was it was a way to engage that idea that it's not my fault.
Yeah, and I think we deep down know it's our fault, probably, but it kind of makes it a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more palatable, right? I mean, there's that
There's a,
little piece. I
there's
don't
a
know, and
difference
that's
between maybe the looking into the past and going, okay, maybe for whatever reason, including I was born this way, not my fault,
yeah,
and then looking into the future going, I'm responsible.
yeah,
So, but it sounds like at least a part of you that found this useful at one point in the past was, okay, this is going to be really difficult to recover, and this is a disease, which means it's not all my fault that this is the way it is, that this is something I have to struggle with.
yeah.
And I think there's other ways to say it. There's other ways to tell ourselves that it's not our fault. So you've probably bumped into that wonderful video that's had some critical appraisal these days, but the video about addiction and Rat Park and the sense
Yeah.
of
Oh, yeah.
context is so crucial in terms of people developing or not addictions. So again, that can be reassuring for people, including me. I've got some quite addictive things that I could easily fall back on. Where
Well,
if I say I was born into a context that made me more susceptible to that.
well, I think even with the disease model and that thought, I think the other thing that probably helped is it just made the going and doing the treatment, doing the work. right? It made it
Mm-hmm.
more important. It was like, okay, this is a disease. Just like if you, and I think we have those connections. If you have a heart
Oh,
condition and the doctor gives you medicine, you take it, and you take it
yeah.
on a schedule. And
Yeah.
so it's one of those things that it's very, and that's why I don't want to downplay it as
So it
being negative.
validates it.
Right. And one, it kind of gives you a schedule, right? Okay, hey,
Mm-hmm.
I have this disease, and it is, we've said, it's some kind of malfunction or dysfunction in the system. And then this stuff helps to alleviate it. And so you start
Mm.
to kind of take that medicine on a prescribed pattern. And I
So
think
it
that
helps
that
people
kind
take
of,
it seriously.
right. I think I think that's probably a great way to say it. You can take it a lot more seriously, and you start to connect those dots where when I go to this, I feel better. When I
Mm.
start to, and maybe you don't connect all the dots of what you're actually doing at a 12-step meeting or in a therapy session, but you
Mm.
start to see and feel, okay, I feel a little bit different. I feel relieved. I feel these different things. And yeah, I think it probably gives that reward. I mean, like
Mm.
addiction obviously gives a reward. You start to
Definitely.
see the reward of seeking out a different path.
Yeah. So that's the link between disease and treatment. It's the idea of, okay, this is serious. If it's a disease, it's
Yeah.
serious. And therefore, what's the treatment? So it will encourage a person to engage a treatment if they realize it's a disease in the first place. But if
Yeah.
they
I think,
don't, if they just think, well, this is normal or this is my normal or whatever, there's no cure, then they can't even engage with the treatment. Okay, so that's the pro. So I'm sensing that this idea that you've moved on, or that you're not like, there's other parts of you that are not fully with that model that it's a disease. So what's that about?
well, I think I try to keep some of those things. I mean, I still go to weekly meetings. Like, it's good. I enjoy it. I have a lot of friendships out of it. I get a lot. It makes my life better.
Mm,
Right. So I still have that. Where it's probably not so much fitting, and maybe it's just a perception. Maybe I've just redefined what that disease is. I've gone from, okay, this is something that's genetic and I'm stuck with, to
mm.
now just kind of, I see it more. I see more of the environmental stuff. The more I dig into what kind of, in my case, caused some of the things that caused me to become addicted and caused me to seek out
Can
that
you share a
escape.
bit
I mean,
more
you
about
kind
that,
of,
about what the environmental factors were?
sure. I mean, we all, I mean, from birth, I know I have a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. And when our son was born, my wife and I were sitting in the hospital and we're talking, and we're like, you see the different people, the different parents, and they're
Mm,
already different, right? Like, I mean, hey, one guy's going out for a smoke break. Somebody's on their
yeah,
phone all the time. Somebody's always down at looking at over the nursery. You see
yeah.
these different parents, and we were talking, we're like, it's amazing from day one.
Mm,
Each one of these kids, like, they're born in the same place, same environment, but then they're going to go out and have these completely different experiences,
mm,
whether it's from financial or just kind of, I mean, views of the world. You're going to have all these different environmental factors that play in. And
mm,
that conversation that we had is really kind of probably one of the things that kind of flipped in my mind when in this whole model of, it's harder for me to wrap my head around this being a genetic disease as much as an environmental malfunction or disorder. And that's in my
mm,
personal life. I mean, yeah, I was always good at sports and very into those things and very competitive. And so you see some of those things carried over, and definitely played a factor in
mm,
my addiction.
mm.
And I can kind of trace back to youth or uh, other different, I guess, just points of discomfort, where then I started using, in my case, gambling as that escape, to not feel those things and to not deal with some of those things when things went south. When I went from being very successful in school and golf and just all things in life, to feeling a little bit insecure and a little bit, I had a lot of fear. I mean,
Mm,
I had those things, and my addiction became my escape. So
mm.
that's, so I guess that's why, I mean, when you start looking at it, and again, it's probably just my definition of a disease has changed and morphed over the years.
Well,
Um,
you're kind of engaging with a model that, for better or worse, I often engage with as well when I'm
okay.
talking about addiction. So you're switching from disease, like something inbuilt that we were born with, no matter what happened to us, to this idea that the behaviors that we call addiction are um, done in order to alleviate distress that's coming from an environmental factor,
Yeah.
and that it doesn't explain the full story though, but that's where maybe the addiction came from. There was an environmental factor that was causing this distress, and that the addiction was created, the behaviors of the addiction were created in order to alleviate that distress. And yours was gambling.
Yeah. Well, it's spot
Okay.
on it. And when you think about it, I mean, going
So it's
back
a
to,
coping strategy.
oh, absolutely. Absolutely a coping. And as far as going back to our whole why is disease, when is it useful? I
Mm.
think that is, I mean, early on, if you're looking at trying to address that, maybe the root of this are the people and environments that you care so much about and you appreciate and you love so much, and they're so close and they would do nothing to harm you, right? But
Mm.
maybe some of those things that they did, I mean, that's really tough to unpack, right? I mean, early on, if you start to dive into that right away, I
Mm.
don't know, that might be a little too much.
It's a lot to go into. Yeah.
Right.
But I guess that's what the addiction is there for, to protect the
Sure.
person from going into that, because it's too
Yeah.
painful.
Right. And so it's kind of that, yeah, it's a tough situation. So yeah, you either go into addiction or you end up eventually you get into dealing with it. And that's, I think, so if the disease model is working for people, I always thought, hey, whatever's working, continue on,
Yeah.
continue on. I always just try to throw out different things.
There's
And
no
that's
right
how,
model.
there's no right model. It's
Mm.
what's right for you
Hmm.
and what's working for you. And that's, if nothing else, I mean, I know personally, I like to take in a lot of different views and thoughts on things because it helps me grow. It
Mm.
challenges my current thoughts, but also gives me something. If down the road, all of a sudden, this model that's been working for me for all this time, all of a sudden I
Mm.
start to have questions. Now I can start to unpack these other areas. And
Cool.
I don't know.
I'm
That's
glad you said you like challenges, because I've got a challenging question
all
here.
right.
So, okay. So addiction comes from an environmental factor. Something's happening in the environment. It's causing distress. The addiction is the behaviors of the addiction are created in order to alleviate that distress. But then how come the addiction can keep going even after the environmental factor is gone?
You're saying, I
The
guess, kind
environment
of
gets
the,
better, but the addiction continues. What's that all about?
well, I don't, maybe it's a different environmental factor. I don't,
Okay.
I, I don't know that we always, I think maybe we relieve, or I guess, what's the proper word? We kind of identify those ones that maybe that's one factor, but there might
Mm.
be some other underlying or other
Mm.
similar ones that are maybe just too uncomfortable to get to at the moment.
Mm.
Um, or
So this is
maybe,
a genuine question
I don't
that I'm
know.
stewing on, that I haven't fully figured out.
Okay.
That the addiction perpetuates itself somehow, even when the environment gets better. So, a lot of addiction can come from abuse, for example, and then the abusers, the person separates themselves from the abusive environment, and yet the addictions don't just go away; they still somehow self-perpetuate. And I've got some addictive behaviors as well, that my life's so much better than what it used to be. And every now and then I'm sitting there feeling perfectly well. Just a crucial detail. I'm just sitting there in my good environment, and then I'll feel this tug towards, come on. I'm like, what? It's like, one, if I did go back there, that would damage my positive environment that I've created through my behaviors and fortune and efforts and whatever. So it's like, what's that tug about? And the only thing I can identify is that it changes the history of addictive behavior, changes the way I relate to distress. This is coming back to our dis-ease,
Yeah.
distress thing. That addiction just becomes a way to deal with any form of distress. It's like, oh, I'm a bit uncomfortable. If I do this, it'll get rid of it.
Right. Well, it worked in the past, right?
It's a really good coping strategy.
I mean, I tell
So
people,
tempting.
I mean, yeah, I mean, gambling's one hell of a drug, as I like to tell people. I mean,
Yeah, there's so
that's
many drugs out there that aren't actually drugs,
sure,
they're behaviors,
absolutely.
but it works.
Yeah. And that's, I mean, and to your point, I mean, it's an escapism and it facilitates. And so, I mean,
Escapism
I
has
think,
that air of moral judgment, though. I
right.
think it's like, yes, it's escapism, and another way to say that, it's a very effective way to delete distress in the moment.
Yes. In the
It's
moment.
just unfortunate that in the long term it creates more distress.
Right. And that's, I like to, I mean, I picked this up from a book, The Full Story, telling yourself the full story, right? The
So
moment
hard
we
to
can
do
go
that.
to the point where and that's, if you can keep that in mind, say, okay, yes, this is going to relieve that current state
Yeah.
and it's
Mm,
going to bring in this result at the end of it,
mm,
because we know it happens every time we go, it happens.
mm-hmm,
But we focus, I think it's part of just being human. I
mm-hmm,
don't know, it's part of the human condition that we're wired to want to have these experiences that we view or at one time viewed as very positive.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, that's, I think anybody in their addictive state, like that was very positive in their mind,
Yeah.
not in reality, but that little piece, that one
And
segment, if
it
you
was
threw out the
genuinely
rest
positive in the moment, just
in the
not
moment,
across a wider period of
correct.
time. Like even just the next day, you wake up and you're like, oh no.
Yeah.
But in the moment, it was, oh, thank God, there was a relief from the
So
distress.
and this might be a weird comparison, but I mean, if you go ahead and you have an amazing meal,
Mm.
it's just absolutely amazing. And it just in the moment tastes wonderful. But then afterwards, the next day you're sick,
Mm.
right? Like I think at some point your mind still wants to go back and enjoy that meal because it was so good. You just
Mm-hmm.
hope you don't get the sickness after. So maybe you
Yeah,
try a different restaurant, or you try a different thing. But I just think that as humans, maybe it's part of you would probably know better, the reward system,
it's so
or
powerful.
yeah, that
And this,
momentary reward
yeah,
becomes very powerful
yeah,
in isolation. It
yeah.
loses its power when we look at that full story, when we start to see the whole spectrum and
Mm.
understand it. And the more we understand it, I think the
Yeah,
better
and I
we
think
become.
it's interesting because it's kind of almost going back to the disease model, except it's not a disease. It's the proper functioning of the neurological mind. But the idea that in the moment when we're thinking, I feel a bit distressed, there's this thing over here that I could do that will get rid of that distress.
Yep.
The very makeup of our minds as normal, well-functioning minds is to favor immediate gratification.
Yeah,
We have to put effort into engaging the full story. We have to take a moment, like be mindful and sit back and go, okay, what's the full story here? Yeah, it's true. I could get immediate gratification here, immediate relief from the distress. Tomorrow, what will it look like? How will it affect my life, me, my well-being, my relationships? What's my financial situation? But we have to, even normal functioning people often have to put effort into that and remind themselves. But if you're an addict, or at least an ex-addict, or have done addictive behaviors in the past, the memory of the relief from the distress is really strong. So you have to
absolutely.
do a little bit of extra work, I think, sometimes. And then
Yeah,
maybe genetically we are kind of different people are built slightly differently.
yeah. I mean, I think you summed it up perfectly. I don't have a whole lot more to add there. I mean, it
Cool.
is incredible, and yeah, all those memories in isolation
Mm,
seem like such a great idea.
mm.
And it's just a matter of how do we reprogram ourselves to look at that full picture, and that's
Great question. That's maybe another video though, because I know you have to go now. But that
yeah, we'll have to
question is
jump off here
maybe,
soon.
yeah, that's maybe a question we can come back to, which is how do, if we're stuck in that mode, because you and I seem to have done some work to get out of it. But if
Yeah,
you're in the middle of it, that question of what do we actually do to help us see the bigger picture in that moment when it's really tempting to act?
yeah.
So yeah, I'm happy to have a future conversation at some point.
No, I enjoy this, and I look forward to future. And that's, I guess, the summary I would say is just whatever is working. That's I always tell
Mm,
people. I try not to inject my views and opinions into other people's situation. It's just kind of, hey,
mm,
this is what works for me. I
mm.
mean, I always sum up my podcast. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have letters before or after my name. You do.
No, well,
So I
only a
can
few.
only speak from my experience.
Mm,
And it's just one of those things. Whatever, if something's working for somebody,
mm,
then look at this and say, Jamie, hey, I don't need any of that. Like, I'm good,
hmm.
and continue on.
I
Um,
totally agree with that approach.
it's
Definitely.
just it's important. I know from being in the 12-step situations where it felt like you weren't allowed to ask some of these questions, and that was one
Mm,
thing that I was really uncomfortable with, and I had to work kind of my way through on the side. And
hmm.
I sought out different people online, and that's when I really started doing some other work, and that was helpful for me. So
And
that's
that's
I
worked for you,
continue to
yeah.
right, and that's why I continue to do this, is to throw out
Hmm.
different things, knowing that some people are going to look at it and say, no, that's not for me. But other people are going to look and say, okay, hey, there's somebody else that is asking some of those same questions.
Hmm.
Because I think that's important.
Definitely. I think the more options people have, the better, so that they can find what works best for them. Totally agree with
Absolutely.
that. Okay, I know you gotta go. So this was great. Really enjoyed it. And
Absolutely.
maybe we'll do another one.
We'll see. Absolutely. I'm all for it. It's amazing I like the whole situation, right? We're in this COVID-19 is taking over, and I do design work. I think you say, I saw in your stuff, you do some design work as well, or did some study some art. And it's amazing what limitations can do to us, right? Like
Yeah.
the greater the limitations, the
Yeah.
more innovative and growth comes out of it. And this is just one of those opportunities. So yeah, I look forward to kind
What's
of
the
seeing where
phrase?
this goes.
Necessity is the mother of all creation. I think it's something like that.
I think it's something like that. So yeah, this is fun. So let's do it again.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And I'll talk to you soon, I hope.
Sounds good. Thanks, John.
Take care. Have a good day.
Thanks, you too.